The most dangerous trap is the one hidden inside a document everyone else already trusts. On the 42nd floor of the Grand Meridian Hotel in downtown Chicago, a single signature stood between Ethan Carter and the largest deal of his career. The conference room overlooked Lake Michigan, where late afternoon sunlight reflected across the water like sheets of liquid gold. Around the polished walnut table sat attorneys, financial advisors, executives, and consultants. Every seat was filled by someone considered an expert. Every voice in the room carried authority. Every person believed the meeting was already over. Ethan leaned back in his chair and glanced at the final page of the contract. $250 million. Months of negotiations. Endless meetings. Countless flights. Everything had led to this moment. Across from him, representatives from a prestigious investment group waited patiently. Their smiles were professional. Their confidence appeared effortless. Ethan understood confidence. He had built an empire from almost nothing. 15 years earlier, he had been a young entrepreneur with more ambition than resources. Now he controlled companies across several industries and employed thousands of people. Yet success had never made life simple, especially after losing his wife 3 years earlier. Since then, every major decision carried an extra weight. It was no longer just about business. It was about protecting the future of his 14-year-old daughter, Emma. The deal in front of him promised stability for decades. At least that was what everyone believed. Ethan picked up the expensive silver pen resting beside the contract. Several attorneys exchanged satisfied glances. One executive quietly checked his watch. Another began gathering papers, already assuming the meeting would conclude within minutes. Outside the room, the hotel continued operating normally. Guests arrived and departed. Elevators moved between floors. Conversations drifted through elegant hallways. Nobody beyond the conference room knew a $250 million agreement was about to be finalized. Among those unnoticed people was Claire Bennett, 29 years old, quiet, reserved, wearing a simple black apron over a white blouse. She worked afternoon shifts, serving coffee and refreshments during corporate meetings. Most executives never remembered her name. Some barely noticed her at all. Claire preferred it that way. Invisible people often heard more than anyone realized. Carrying a polished tray lined with coffee cups, she moved through the hallway outside the conference room. Through the partially open door, she caught fragments of conversation. Financial projections, market expansion, asset protection, legal terminology. None of it should have mattered to her. She was simply delivering coffee. Yet one phrase drifted into the hallway and made her pause. A specific legal term. Brief. Technical. Easy to miss. Claire froze for half a second. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. Then she continued walking. Inside the conference room, Ethan placed the pen against the final page. The room grew still. Months of work had led to a single movement of his hand. Nobody questioned the contract. Nobody questioned the experts. Nobody questioned the opportunity. And hidden among hundreds of pages was a single clause that would soon change everything. At that exact moment, a shy waitress carrying a tray of coffee turned toward the conference room door, unaware that the next few minutes would alter the course of several lives forever. Claire continued down the hallway, but the phrase refused to leave her mind. She had heard thousands of business conversations while working at the Grand Meridian Hotel. Most blended together into a background hum of numbers, forecasts, and corporate language. This one felt different. The legal term she had overheard was not unusual by itself. What unsettled her was where it had appeared. She reached the service station near the elevators and carefully set down her tray. Through the large window beside her, the Chicago skyline glowed beneath the fading afternoon sun. Normally, she enjoyed this part of the day. Today, her attention remained fixed on the conference room upstairs. Meanwhile, inside the meeting, Ethan Carter listened as one of his attorneys summarized the final protections included in the agreement. Everything sounded reassuring. Risk had been minimized. Revenue projections were strong. Regulatory concerns had been addressed. The investment group sitting across the table appeared confident and cooperative. Every indicator suggested success. Ethan glanced briefly at a photograph displayed on his tablet screen. It showed his daughter Emma standing beside Lake Michigan the previous summer. She was smiling, but he remembered how difficult that smile had been to earn. Since losing her mother, Emma had become quieter, more guarded. Ethan carried that reality into every major decision. He was not building wealth for himself anymore. He was building security for her future. Across the room, senior executives exchanged satisfied looks. The deal would open new markets and increase company value substantially. Months of preparation were finally paying off. Yet a strange feeling lingered in the back of Ethan's mind. He could not explain it. Perhaps it was simply the pressure of signing something so significant. Perhaps it was fatigue. He ignored it and returned his attention to the contract. Several floors below, Claire tried to focus on work. She delivered coffee to another meeting, cleared tables in the hotel lounge, restocked supplies behind the cafe counter. Still, the same thought kept returning. The clause structure sounded familiar. Not because she worked in hospitality, because years earlier she had spent countless nights studying legal documents. Before life changed direction, before family responsibilities forced different choices. Knowledge has a strange way of remaining hidden until the moment it becomes necessary. By 6 o'clock, most guests would never have guessed anything unusual was happening. The hotel remained elegant and calm. Soft piano music drifted through the lobby. Business travelers checked in at the front desk. Evening sunlight painted long golden reflections across marble floors. Yet behind one conference room door, a decision worth $250 million was approaching its final moment. Claire picked up another tray and headed toward the executive floor. As the elevator climbed, her heartbeat felt slightly faster than usual. She told herself she was imagining things. She told herself experts knew more than she ever could. She told herself it was none of her business. The elevator doors opened. The hallway stretched ahead in silence. Through the glass beside the conference room, she could see Ethan holding the silver pen again. The final signatures were only minutes away. Claire slowed her steps. For a brief moment, she stood completely still. Then her eyes drifted toward the stack of documents on the table, and a growing sense of concern settled over her like a shadow she could no longer ignore. Claire balanced the tray carefully as she walked toward the conference room for what should have been a routine delivery. The hallway was quiet except for the distant hum of elevators and the muted sounds of evening activity throughout the hotel. With every step, the feeling in her chest grew stronger. It was not certainty. It was not confidence. It was simply concern. The kind that refuses to disappear no matter how many times a person tries to ignore it. Through the glass wall beside the room, she could see the meeting continuing. Attorneys reviewed notes. Executives checked figures. Representatives from the investment group remained relaxed and composed. Everything appeared normal. Yet Claire could not stop thinking about the language she had overheard. Years earlier, she had spent countless evenings studying contract law while attending Northwestern University. She had not completed her degree. Life had taken another path after her father became seriously ill. Tuition money became medical bills. Dreams became responsibilities. Eventually, she left school and entered the workforce. Most people who met her never knew that part of her story. They saw a waitress carrying coffee. Nothing more. But knowledge does not disappear simply because circumstances change. It waits quietly, sometimes for years. Claire entered the conference room and began placing fresh cups near each attendee. Nobody paid much attention to her. Conversations continued. Numbers were discussed. Projections were repeated. Then one attorney mentioned a specific section buried deep within the agreement. Claire glanced toward the open document. Her eyes landed briefly on a page number. Then another phrase reached her ears. This time her concern sharpened instantly. The pieces connected. Not all of them. Just enough. She continued serving coffee while her mind raced. The clause structure. The transfer language. The delayed trigger provision. Individually, each element seemed harmless. Together, they created something very different. Claire finished distributing the coffee and stepped back toward the door. Her hands remained steady, but her thoughts did not. She knew what would happen if she spoke. The room was filled with accomplished professionals, experienced attorneys, financial experts, corporate leaders. She was none of those things, at least not in their eyes. If she interrupted, she would almost certainly be dismissed, perhaps embarrassed, perhaps ignored. Yet another thought troubled her even more. What if she stayed silent and her suspicion proved correct? At the head of the table, Ethan Carter reviewed the final signature page again. He appeared focused, but exhaustion lingered behind his eyes. Claire noticed it immediately. She had seen that expression before on parents visiting the hotel with children. the look of someone carrying more responsibility than anyone else realized. Ethan checked the time. The investment group representatives exchanged confident smiles. One of them gently slid the contract closer. Everything was moving toward the finish line. Claire reached the doorway and stopped. The city skyline glowed beyond the glass walls. The room felt suddenly smaller. Her pulse quickened. She told herself to leave. She told herself it was not her place. Then her gaze returned to the contract one final time. And in that moment, she realized she could no longer walk away pretending she had not seen the warning signs gathering in plain sight. Claire remained at the doorway for several seconds that felt much longer. The conference room continued moving toward its conclusion as if nothing were wrong. One executive laughed softly at a comment from across the table. An attorney organized the final pages. The representatives from the investment group appeared perfectly comfortable. Everything looked polished, predictable, safe. Yet the uneasiness inside Claire continued growing. She knew enough about contracts to understand that the most dangerous problems rarely announce themselves. They hid beneath ordinary language. They waited behind assumptions. And sometimes they survived because everyone trusted the wrong thing. The experts. Ethan adjusted his chair and glanced once more toward the final signature page. The silver pen rested inches from his hand. Months of work were about to become reality. He thought briefly about Emma waiting at home. Earlier that week, she had mentioned a summer art program she wanted to attend. It was the first time in months she had shown genuine excitement about anything. Ethan had promised himself he would create every opportunity possible for her future. That promise sat behind every decision he made. Claire looked at the documents again. The same concern returned immediately. She could not prove it. Not yet. She had only fragments. A pattern. A possibility. But experience had taught her that instincts should not be ignored when they were rooted in knowledge. Her father used to say that responsibility begins the moment you notice something others miss. The memory arrived unexpectedly. For a brief moment, she saw herself years earlier at a kitchen table covered with law textbooks. She remembered long nights studying contract interpretation. She remembered professors warning students about provisions hidden behind harmless language. She remembered believing she would someday practice law. Life had taken another direction, but those lessons remained. Inside the conference room, one of the attorneys turned another page. Claire caught sight of a paragraph heading. Her eyes widened slightly. The heading confirmed what she feared. Not certainty. Confirmation that her concern deserved attention. She knew she should leave. Hotel staff were not supposed to interrupt executive meetings, especially meetings involving transactions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet another voice inside her asked a simple question. What if nobody else notices until it is too late? Ethan lifted the pen. Around the table, anticipation quietly spread. Several people smiled. One representative from the investment group folded his hands and leaned forward. The moment had arrived. Claire felt her pulse quicken. The room suddenly seemed unusually silent. She could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning system. She could hear distant elevator doors opening somewhere down the hallway. She could hear her own thoughts arguing against one another. Then Ethan lowered the pen toward the paper. Something inside Claire finally settled. Not the uncertainty, the decision. She took a small step forward. Then another. Her tray remained balanced in her hands. The executives barely noticed her movement. To them, she was simply the waitress collecting empty coffee cups. Invisible. Harmless. Easy to overlook. Claire stopped beside the table and looked directly at the contract. For the first time that evening, she chose not to remain invisible. The words formed quietly in her mind. A warning she never expected to speak aloud. And as Ethan's pen hovered above the signature line, Claire drew a careful breath, knowing that the next sentence could change everything for everyone in the room. Excuse me. Claire's voice was soft. So soft that at first nobody reacted. The conference room remained frozen in the final seconds before completion. Ethan's pen hovered above the signature line. Several executives continued looking at their documents. One attorney was already reaching for another folder. Then Claire spoke again, slightly louder this time. I think there may be a problem with that agreement. The room changed instantly. Every head turned toward her. Silence spread across the table. For a moment, nobody seemed to understand what had happened. Claire stood beside the door holding a silver serving tray against her apron. She looked completely out of place in a room filled with million-dollar decisions. One of the attorneys blinked in confusion. Another frowned. Ethan slowly lowered his pen and looked at her directly. What did you say? Claire swallowed carefully. Her heart was racing now. There was no turning back. I believe there may be a problem with one of the contract provisions. The words hung in the air. Across the table, one of the investment representatives shifted in his chair. Another executive let out a short laugh, assuming it had to be a misunderstanding. The senior attorney nearest Ethan smiled politely. Thank you, miss, but our legal team has reviewed every section extensively. Claire nodded. I am sure they have. Her voice remained respectful. Calm. But I heard a reference to the contingent asset transfer clause. The attorney's smile faded slightly. Ethan's attention sharpened. Claire continued. Combined with the delayed performance trigger and the secondary valuation language, the room became noticeably quieter. Several attorneys exchanged glances. One executive slowly lowered the coffee cup he had been holding. Ethan noticed the change immediately. People who had looked relaxed seconds earlier suddenly appeared more alert. Go on, Ethan said. Claire hesitated. Not because she doubted herself. Because she understood how unusual this situation was. She was a waitress interrupting a $250 million transaction. Yet the concern inside her refused to disappear. The clauses seem independent when viewed separately, she said carefully. But if they operate together, they may create a transfer obligation under conditions that are not immediately obvious. One attorney leaned forward. What exactly are you suggesting? Claire looked toward the open contract. I am suggesting there may be language allowing asset exposure beyond the valuation assumptions presented in the executive summary. Nobody spoke. Ethan watched the faces around the table. For the first time all evening, uncertainty appeared. Small, subtle, but real. One attorney immediately reached for the document. Another began turning pages. A representative from the investment group adjusted his posture and glanced toward a colleague. Claire noticed everything. Not because she was searching for reactions, because tension has a way of revealing itself. Ethan stood slowly from his chair. Which section? He asked. Claire pointed carefully toward a page near the center of the agreement. Section 47. The cross-reference. Provision. The attorney opened the page. Another attorney moved closer. A third began reviewing related sections. Seconds passed. Then minutes. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody smiled. The conference room that had been preparing to celebrate now felt completely different. Ethan looked from the contract to Claire. She remained standing quietly beside the door, still holding her tray, still wearing her apron, still looking like the least important person in the room. Yet for the first time that evening, she was the only person everyone was listening to. The next 10 minutes felt longer than the entire meeting that had come before them. Pages turned. Notes were reviewed. Attorneys leaned closer together and spoke in increasingly quiet voices. The confidence that had filled the room began to fade. Ethan remained standing beside the table, watching every reaction carefully. Years in business had taught him something important. People often revealed the truth before they spoke it. A tightened jaw, a delayed answer, a glance exchanged too quickly. He was seeing all three. Claire stayed near the doorway. She had expected someone to dismiss her by now. Instead, nobody seemed interested in sending her away. The contract had become the center of attention. The senior attorney who had initially challenged her was now reviewing multiple sections simultaneously. Another attorney opened a laptop and searched through supporting documents connected to the agreement. Across the table, the representatives from the investment group no longer looked entirely comfortable. One of them requested a glass of water. Another repeatedly adjusted his tie. Ethan noticed those details too. Finally, one attorney broke the silence. The cross-reference provision is broader than I initially realized. Nobody responded immediately. The statement itself was small. The implication was not. Ethan folded his arms. Explain. The attorney took a slow breath. If the trigger conditions are activated under specific valuation circumstances, there could be an obligation extending beyond the assets outlined in the executive summary. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Meaning? Another attorney answered. Meaning? The exposure could be significantly larger than what was presented during negotiations. The room became completely still. One executive stared down at the contract as if seeing it for the first time. Another quietly removed his glasses. Ethan looked toward the investment group representatives. Their expressions remained controlled, but the confidence from earlier had vanished. Claire felt her pulse quicken again. She had hoped she was wrong. Part of her still hoped she was wrong. Yet the deeper the attorneys looked, the more concerned they appeared. The senior attorney turned toward her. For the first time all evening, there was no trace of condescension in his voice. "How did you catch this?" Claire hesitated. Every eye in the room shifted toward her. She glanced down briefly before answering. The language structure felt familiar. Familiar from where? Another attorney asked. Claire looked at the contract. Law school. Several people blinked. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Nobody had expected that answer. Claire continued quietly. "I studied contract law before leaving the program." No dramatic explanation followed. No attempt to impress anyone. Just a simple fact. Ethan studied her for a moment. The waitress carrying coffee trays suddenly looked very different. Not because she had changed, because the room had finally begun seeing what had always been there. One attorney returned his attention to the contract and shook his head slowly. "If she had not spoken up, we probably would have signed tonight." Another attorney nodded in agreement. The words landed heavily. Ethan glanced toward the silver pin resting on the table. Minutes earlier it had seemed like a symbol of success. Now it looked like something else entirely. Through the conference room windows, the last sunlight faded behind the Chicago skyline. Darkness slowly settled across the city. Inside the room, nobody talked about celebration anymore. Nobody discussed closing the deal. They were focused on a far more unsettling realization. The person who may have protected them from a catastrophic mistake was not sitting at the table. She was standing beside the door wearing a black apron and holding an empty serving tray. No one asked Claire to leave. That alone felt surreal. 10 minutes earlier, she had been invisible. Now attorneys were asking questions and taking notes based on her observations. The shift in the room was impossible to ignore. The contract remained open across the table. Pages were covered with handwritten marks. Multiple sections had been highlighted. Every new review seemed to uncover another layer of complexity hidden beneath language that initially appeared routine. Ethan sat down again, but did not touch the silver pen. The deal that had seemed certain now felt unstable. He watched as his legal team compared provisions across several sections of the agreement. Their expressions grew more serious with every passing minute. Finally, one of the senior attorneys looked up. "The structure is extremely unusual." Ethan leaned forward. "Unusual does not mean dangerous." "No," the attorney replied carefully. "But in this case, the two may be connected." Another attorney rotated a laptop screen toward the group. Charts and contract references filled the display. The trigger mechanism creates a chain reaction. He pointed to several highlighted passages. If specific performance benchmarks are missed after acquisition, asset control rights could expand dramatically. Ethan stared at the screen. "Beyond what we negotiated?" "Far beyond." The answer arrived immediately. Silence followed. Across the table, the representatives from the investment group remained composed, but their confidence continued eroding. One of them attempted to explain the language as standard industry practice. Another insisted the clauses had been disclosed properly. Yet the room no longer accepted explanations at face value. Questions came faster now. Detailed questions. Precise questions. The kind that appear when trust begins to weaken. Claire listened quietly from her position near the wall. She never intended to become part of the discussion. Yet she recognized something else unfolding beneath the legal analysis. People were no longer defending assumptions. They were searching for facts. Ethan appreciated that difference. It was one reason he had built successful companies. Assumptions create confidence. Facts create protection. A third attorney entered the room after being called from another floor of the hotel. He reviewed the relevant sections for several minutes without speaking. Then he slowly removed his glasses. "She is correct." Nobody interrupted him. The cross-reference language fundamentally changes the risk profile of the agreement. Ethan felt a chill run through him despite the comfortable temperature of the room. "How significant?" The attorney answered without hesitation. "Potentially catastrophic if certain conditions occur." The words settled heavily across the conference table. Catastrophic. Not inconvenient. Not problematic. Catastrophic. Ethan looked toward Claire. She immediately lowered her eyes, uncomfortable with the attention. Yet for the second time that evening, he noticed something remarkable. She was not trying to prove herself right. She seemed more concerned about the consequences than about receiving credit. That realization stayed with him. One executive quietly shook his head. How did every review miss this? Nobody had a satisfying answer. Perhaps they trusted the summary reports too much. Perhaps they focused on familiar sections while overlooking subtle interactions between clauses. Perhaps success had made them comfortable. Whatever the reason, the reality remained unchanged. A waitress had identified a danger that experienced professionals failed to see. Outside the conference room windows, Chicago's lights sparkled against the dark evening sky. Inside, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The deal was no longer approaching completion. It was approaching scrutiny. And for the first time all night, Ethan began to wonder what else might be hiding beneath the surface of the agreement. The deeper the attorneys investigated, the more uncomfortable the room became. What had started as a simple review of one provision was expanding into something much larger. Laptops remained open across the conference table. New documents were requested. Additional financial models were pulled from secure databases. Every answer seemed to create two new questions. Ethan watched the process unfold with growing concern. He had spent years evaluating risk. He understood that small inconsistencies often pointed toward larger problems. Tonight, the inconsistencies were multiplying. One attorney compared the agreement against earlier drafts exchanged during negotiations. Another examined disclosures provided by the investment group. A third reviewed communications dating back several months. The pattern emerging was difficult to ignore. Certain changes had appeared late in the process. Others had been presented as routine updates. Individually, none seemed alarming. Together, they painted a different picture. Across the table, the investment group representatives became increasingly defensive. They insisted the language was standard. They argued that every amendment had been properly documented. Yet their explanations sounded less convincing with each passing minute. Ethan noticed that as well. Confidence usually became clearer under scrutiny, not weaker. Claire remained quiet. She had no desire to participate further unless someone asked. In many ways, she wished she were downstairs serving coffee and clearing tables. Yet she could not leave now. Too much was happening. One attorney suddenly looked up from his screen. There is another issue. Every conversation stopped immediately. He turned his laptop toward the group. The valuation assumptions used in the risk projections appear incomplete. Ethan frowned. Incomplete how? The attorney pointed towards several figures. Certain exposure scenarios were excluded from the executive summary. Another attorney quickly reviewed the information and nodded. He is right. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. The executive summary had been one of the most important documents supporting the transaction. It was the document most decision-makers relied upon. If critical scenarios had been omitted, then the entire risk assessment became questionable. The room grew noticeably quieter. One representative from the investment group attempted to explain the omission as a technical oversight. Another described it as an alternative modeling approach. Neither explanation seemed persuasive. Ethan leaned back in his chair and studied the people across from him. For months, they had presented themselves as trusted partners. Now, every answer sounded carefully constructed. Every explanation invited further doubt. The atmosphere shifted from confidence to investigation. Then another discovery arrived. One of the attorneys reviewing supporting documents identified language connecting the disputed clause to a secondary asset structure discussed only briefly during negotiations. The implications were significant. If certain conditions occurred after the acquisition, control rights could expand far beyond what Ethan's team believed they were purchasing. The room fell silent again. Even the investment representatives stopped arguing. They simply exchanged uneasy glances. Ethan looked toward Claire. She was standing exactly where she had been 20 minutes earlier. Same apron, same quiet posture, same calm expression. Yet the chain reaction unfolding around the room had begun with her willingness to speak. That realization became impossible to ignore. One executive shook his head slowly. If we signed tonight, how long before we discovered all this? Nobody answered immediately. Finally, the senior attorney spoke. Possibly months. The words landed heavily. Months. Long after the agreement became binding. Long after options disappeared. Long after the damage could have been prevented. Outside the conference room, Chicago continued moving through another ordinary evening. Cars crossed bridges. Restaurants filled with customers. Office towers glowed against the night sky. Inside the Grand Meridian Hotel, however, a $250 million deal was rapidly transforming into something else entirely. And Ethan Carter was beginning to realize that the biggest danger had never been the contract itself. It was how close everyone had come to signing it without asking the right questions. By 9 o'clock that evening, the conference room looked nothing like it had a few hours earlier. The polished atmosphere of a successful closing had disappeared. Documents covered the table. Coffee cups sat forgotten beside open laptops. The excitement surrounding the transaction had been replaced by careful investigation. Ethan remained focused despite the growing fatigue visible in his eyes. He wanted facts, nothing else. One attorney had spent nearly an hour reviewing supporting disclosures connected to the agreement. Another had been speaking with outside specialists by phone. Every new piece of information seemed to confirm the same conclusion. The risks were not accidental. They had been hidden behind complexity. The realization unsettled everyone. Shortly after 9:15, one of the attorneys ended a phone call and slowly placed his device on the table. His expression alone drew immediate attention. "We found something." The room became silent. Ethan looked directly at him. "What is it?" The attorney opened a file and turned several pages. The language added during the final negotiation phase appears connected to a separate acquisition structure used in previous transactions. Ethan frowned. "Is that unusual?" "Not by itself." The attorney paused. "But the same structure has been involved in multiple disputes over asset control and valuation exposure." Several executives exchanged worried looks. Ethan leaned forward. "Are you telling me this was intentional?" The attorney chose his words carefully. "I am saying the pattern is difficult to ignore." Across the table, the representatives from the investment group immediately objected. They described the similarities as coincidence, industry practice, standard legal architecture. Yet their explanations sounded increasingly strained. Ethan listened without interruption. Then he asked a simple question. Why were these risks never emphasized during negotiations? Nobody answered immediately. The silence that followed spoke louder than any explanation. Claire watched quietly from the side of the room. She could feel the emotional shift happening in real time. Earlier, everyone had been focused on the opportunity. Now they were focused on trust. And once trust becomes uncertain, every document looks different. One attorney projected additional materials onto a large screen mounted on the wall. Comparative analyses appeared beside excerpts from the agreement. Charts highlighted financial exposure scenarios, extending far beyond what Ethan's team had originally expected. The room grew increasingly uncomfortable. Finally, the senior attorney summarized what everyone was beginning to understand. Had this agreement been executed tonight, the company could have faced substantial obligations under conditions that were never clearly presented. Ethan stared at the screen for several seconds. Then he looked toward the contract resting near the center of the table. The silver pen remained exactly where he had left it, untouched. He thought about how close he had come to signing. Minutes, perhaps less. The realization felt heavier than the numbers involved. It was not only about money. It was about responsibility. Thousands of employees depended on decisions made in rooms like this. So did Emma. The future he worked so hard to protect could have been placed at risk because everyone trusted appearances instead of asking harder questions. Ethan slowly stood. The room immediately fell silent again. Every person present knew what his next decision would mean. He looked around the table one final time. Then his gaze settled briefly on Claire, the waitress who had arrived carrying coffee, the woman who had seen what nobody else noticed. Outside the windows, Chicago sparkled beneath the night sky. Inside, the course of the entire transaction was about to change forever. The decision came without hesitation. Ethan placed both hands on the conference table and looked directly at every person in the room. The city lights reflected across the glass walls behind him, turning the conference room into a mirror of shadows and determination. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Ethan finally broke the silence. "We are not signing tonight." The words landed with enormous weight. Months of negotiations stopped in a single sentence. Across the table, the investment group representatives immediately exchanged alarmed looks. One of them leaned forward. "Mr. Carter, perhaps we should continue reviewing the concerns before making a decision this significant." Ethan remained calm. "That is exactly what I am doing." Another representative attempted a reassuring smile. "These issues can be clarified." "Then they should have been clarified before this meeting," Ethan replied. Nobody challenged him after that. The atmosphere had changed too much. Trust, once damaged, does not return because someone asks politely. Around the table, Ethan's attorneys appeared relieved. Exhausted, but relieved. Several executives nodded quietly. Nobody seemed interested in defending the agreement anymore. The risks had become impossible to ignore. Ethan looked down at the untouched silver pen. Earlier it had represented achievement. Now it represented something else entirely. A mistake narrowly avoided. He pushed it gently away from the contract. The movement felt symbolic. Final. One attorney gathered the documents into a single stack. Another began discussing next steps for a full independent review. The investment group representatives continued offering explanations, but their voices no longer carried authority. They sounded like people trying to regain control of a conversation that had already moved beyond them. Through it all, Claire remained near the doorway. She expected someone to thank her eventually, maybe ask a few more questions. Instead, she became almost invisible again as attention shifted toward damage assessment and legal strategy. Strangely, she preferred it that way. She had never stepped forward seeking recognition. She simply could not remain silent when something felt wrong. Ethan noticed that too. As the meeting slowly dissolved into smaller conversations, he found himself watching her. Not because she had identified a problem, because she had spoken when every incentive encouraged silence. That required something more valuable than expertise. It required courage. Nearly an hour later, the conference room finally began to empty. Attorneys carried laptops and files into the hallway. Executives made phone calls. Staff members coordinated follow-up meetings. The energy of the evening had completely transformed. No celebration. No signed agreement. Just relief mixed with unanswered questions. Ethan walked toward the doorway where Claire stood holding her tray. For a moment, neither spoke. The contrast between them felt almost surreal. One of the most powerful business leaders in the city. One quiet waitress in a black apron. Yet without her, the outcome of the night could have been very different. Claire, right? Ethan asked. She looked surprised that he knew her name. Yes. Ethan nodded slowly. I think you may have saved my company tonight. Claire immediately shook her head. Your attorneys found the problem. Ethan glanced back toward the conference table. Only after you pointed them toward it. Claire lowered her eyes slightly, uncomfortable with praise. Ethan noticed that as well. The people most deserving of recognition often seemed least interested in receiving it. Outside the hotel windows, Chicago continued shining beneath the night sky. Inside the quiet hallway, Ethan Carter realized the most important person he had met that evening was never supposed to be part of the meeting at all. The meeting ended shortly before midnight. Most of the executives left carrying folders and unanswered questions. Attorneys headed toward waiting elevators while discussing revisions, investigations, and risk assessments. The energy that remained was quieter now. Reflective. Claire collected empty coffee cups from the conference room and placed them carefully onto her tray. The room looked ordinary again. Papers had been removed. Chairs had been pushed back into place. Yet she knew the evening would not be forgotten. As she prepared to leave, Ethan approached her once more. Do you have a few minutes? He asked. Claire hesitated before nodding. They moved to a quiet seating area overlooking the city. The lights of Chicago stretched across the horizon like thousands of distant stars. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan asked the question that had been on his mind since the attorneys confirmed her concerns. Why are you working as a waitress? Claire smiled faintly. Not because the question surprised her. Because she had heard it before. Because life does not always follow the plan we make for it. Ethan listened. Claire looked out at the city as she continued. I attended law school for almost 3 years. I loved it. I thought I knew exactly where my future was heading. Her voice remained calm, steady. Then my father became ill. My mother had already passed away years earlier. There was nobody else to help him. Ethan said nothing. Claire appreciated that. Too often people interrupted difficult stories with sympathy before understanding them. The medical expenses kept growing. I left school. I started working. 1 year became 2. 2 became 5. She shrugged gently. Eventually, it stopped feeling temporary. Ethan looked at her differently now. Not with surprise. With respect. He understood sacrifice. He understood how quickly priorities could change when family needed you. Since losing his wife, nearly every decision in his own life had revolved around Emma. Success often looked glamorous from a distance. Up close, it usually involved giving something up. Do you regret it? Ethan asked quietly. Claire thought for a moment. Sometimes I regret what I lost. She smiled softly. But I do not regret taking care of my father. The answer lingered between them. Honest. Uncomplicated. Ethan found himself admiring it. In business, people often shape their stories to sound impressive. Claire did the opposite. She simply told the truth. A few minutes later, Ethan returned home. The house was quiet except for a lamp glowing in the living room. Emma sat curled up on the sofa sketching in a notebook. She looked up as he entered. Long meeting, she asked. Ethan smiled. Longer than expected. Emma studied him for a second. Something happened. It was not a question. Ethan laughed softly. You are getting harder to fool every year. Emma grinned. For the first time that day, some of the weight on Ethan's shoulders eased. As he sat beside his daughter, his thoughts briefly returned to the woman in the hotel apron. The quiet waitress who had changed the direction of an entire evening. He still did not know everything about Claire Bennett. But one thing had become clear. Sometimes the most remarkable people were the ones the world stopped noticing far too soon. 3 days passed before Ethan saw Claire again. The legal review continued around the clock. Independent experts examined every section of the agreement. Outside counsel reviewed negotiation records. Financial analysts rebuilt risk models from the ground up. Each new report reinforced the same conclusion. The decision not to sign had protected the company from consequences far greater than anyone initially understood. Yet the outcome that occupied Ethan's thoughts most was not the investigation. It was Claire. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, Ethan returned to the Grand Meridian Hotel with Emma. His daughter looked surprised when they entered the cafe instead of one of their usual weekend destinations. What are we doing here? She asked. Ethan smiled. Meeting someone. Claire was working behind the counter when they arrived. She looked genuinely startled to see them. Even more surprised when Ethan introduced Emma. The teenager offered a polite smile and sat beside her father. At first the conversation was simple. Coffee, school, Chicago weather, everyday topics. But something unexpected happened. Emma began talking. Really talking. She spoke about her artwork, her favorite books, the difficulty of losing confidence after losing someone she loved. Claire listened without interrupting, without trying to solve anything. She simply listened. Ethan watched the exchange quietly. Over the past few years, many people had attempted to help Emma. Counselors, teachers, family friends. Most meant well. Yet very few connected with her naturally. Claire somehow did. Perhaps because she never treated Emma like a problem that needed fixing. She treated her like a person whose voice mattered. Nearly an hour passed. At one point Emma showed Claire's sketches stored on her tablet. Claire studied each one carefully. These are beautiful, she said. Emma smiled. Not the polite smile Ethan saw so often. A real one. The kind that reached her eyes. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. Not sadness. Relief. Later, after Emma stepped away to order another drink, Ethan finally asked a question that had been on his mind. Have you ever thought about going back? Claire understood immediately. Law school. The dream she had set aside years earlier. She looked down at her coffee cup. Sometimes. Ethan nodded. And Claire smiled softly. Life gets busy. Responsibilities do not disappear just because you have plans. Ethan considered her answer. Then he said something she did not expect. Responsibilities can shape a life. They should not erase one. Claire looked at him for several seconds without speaking. The words stayed with her because they carried no judgment, only understanding. When Emma returned, the conversation shifted again. Laughter replaced seriousness. Stories replaced silence. As afternoon sunlight streamed through the cafe windows, Ethan noticed something remarkable. The most valuable thing Claire had given his company was not her knowledge of contracts. It was perspective. She reminded people to pay attention, to ask questions, to see what others overlooked. Before leaving, Emma handed Claire a small folded sketch she had drawn during their conversation. Claire opened it carefully. It showed 3 figures sitting around a cafe table beneath the Chicago skyline. On the bottom corner, Emma had written a simple sentence. Thank you for listening. Claire looked up. Ethan saw emotion flicker briefly across her face. And in that quiet moment, all 3 understood that some of the most important changes in life begin with a conversation nobody planned to have. 1 year later, the auditorium overlooking the Chicago River was filled with people from every corner of the city. Business leaders occupied the front rows. University faculty members sat nearby. Students filled entire sections of the audience. Large windows revealed a bright spring afternoon beyond the stage. The atmosphere carried the quiet excitement that comes before an important moment. Backstage, Claire Bennett stood alone for a few seconds and looked down at the speech folded neatly in her hands. She smiled to herself. A year earlier, she had been carrying a tray of coffee through the Grand Meridian Hotel. Now she was preparing to address hundreds of people. Life rarely announced its turning points when they happened. Sometimes they arrived disguised as ordinary days. The previous year had transformed more than anyone expected. After months of encouragement, Claire had returned to complete her legal education through a special academic program. Scholarships had helped. Determination had done the rest. The journey had not been easy. She still worked long hours. She still cared for family responsibilities. Yet for the first time in years, the future she once imagined no longer felt impossible. Out in the audience, Ethan Carter sat beside Emma. The two shared a quiet smile as the event prepared to begin. The investigation into the failed acquisition had ultimately revealed exactly what Claire suspected. Hidden risks, misleading assumptions, serious exposure that could have harmed thousands of employees and investors. The agreement had been abandoned permanently. Ethan's company remained strong. In some ways, stronger than before. Not because of the deal that happened, because of the mistake that did not. Emma had changed as well. Over the past year, she had become more confident, more open. Her artwork had earned recognition at school. She still carried grief, but it no longer carried her. Ethan often thought about the afternoon in the cafe when Claire simply listened. Sometimes healing begins when someone makes another person feel seen. A voice announced Claire's name. Applause filled the auditorium. Claire stepped onto the stage. For a moment she paused beneath the lights and looked across the audience. Her eyes found Ethan and Emma among the crowd. Both stood and applauded with everyone else. Claire felt emotion rise unexpectedly, not because of recognition, because she remembered every difficult step that had brought her there. The sacrifices, the setbacks, the years spent believing certain doors had closed forever. When the applause settled, Claire approached the podium. She looked at the audience, then folded her prepared speech and set it aside. The room became quiet. A year ago, she began, I thought my story was finished. The audience listened carefully. Claire spoke about resilience, responsibility, opportunity. She spoke about paying attention when something feels wrong. She spoke about the importance of using whatever knowledge life gives you, even when nobody expects it from you. When she finished, the applause lasted longer than before. As people rose to their feet, Ethan felt a sense of gratitude that was difficult to describe. Not because Claire had protected a business transaction, because she had reminded everyone in that room of something far more important. After the event ended, sunlight spilled across the river outside as people slowly departed. Claire stood near the entrance speaking with students. Ethan and Emma watched from a distance for a moment before joining the crowd. The city moved around them exactly as it always had. Cars crossed bridges. Boats drifted along the water. People hurried toward their next destination. Yet for those who knew the full story, one truth remained unforgettable. The most valuable person in the room is often the one nobody notices until the moment they choose to speak.